Okay, perfect. I'm back. So I'm thinking, okay, so it's recording right now. So, okay, well, Bram, it's a pleasure for us here in ASOLOG to have you here in this chat. The idea today is to talk about your ideas and your views related with important things about supply chain. One important thing is about cost. Is something that you mentioned in your books, the importance of this triangle in the supply chain, the cost, the customer service, and things related with cash, and how we manage this in the supply chain. So can you explain us more about the triangle in the supply chain?
Yes, most happy. When I wrote my first book, and that book was published in 2018, initially the book was going to be about inventory optimization, because I did a lot of inventory optimization projects and I have a PhD in multi-echelon inventory optimization. But yeah, what I discovered is that I saw that companies really struggle with inventory as part of that triangle and say, okay, but we have inventory, part of it because we want to deliver service. We have inventory, part of it is also because we want to optimize costs. So we might produce or buy in certain minimum batches or minimum order quantities. I may need safety stocks to be able to provide service. And in general, I saw that companies struggle with balancing that triangle of service, cost, and cash. And throughout the years, I said, yeah, but the typical definition of supply chain is about a flow of goods and an inverse flow of information. And for me, the triangle even became a different definition of supply chain. I said, when I look at what I see the supply chain manager struggling with, it's really with balancing that triangle. So that supply chain triangle for me almost became the starting point of what is supply chain. For me, supply chain is about balancing that triangle. And in the book side, I also try to link that supply chain triangle to financial metrics. I also try to illustrate how different strategies lead to a different balance in that supply chain triangle. So yeah, it started from the trying to better understand how inventory is linked to other aspects. That's where it started from, but it grew into a different view and a different definition of what the essence of supply chain is really about.
Great. And when we're trying to balance this triangle in the supply chain, most companies try, not all companies have done this yet, use SNOP to try to balance and put the ideas in order, or they use something like a IBP to try to work together. Is it still important to use SNOP and IBP inside companies, and how this method can help companies?
Yes, I think it's more crucial than ever before. And SNOP or IBP doesn't necessarily have a good name, because many companies have tried to implement SNOP, but many companies have difficulties to really get to the right maturity level. And so we would like to be maturity level 3 or 4, but in practice, yeah, we may have parts of SNOP. We may be strong in demand planning, yeah, or we might have a good supply planning tool, but really balancing the broader SNOP process is a big struggle for companies. So some people would even ask me the question, do we still need SNOP? And I say, yes, we need it more than ever before, because of COVID here in Europe, the war between Russia and Ukraine, rising energy prices, inflation. The world is a lot more dynamic the last 2 to 3 years than it was in the period 2010 to 2020. So I turn it around and I say, tell me how you will operate your supply chain without having a proper working S&OP process. Yeah, and so having a view of, okay, where is the demand going over the next few months? We're not sure. Well, what are then the scenarios? What are the options where it could go this way, it could go that way? Okay, if it goes left, what would be the impact on our capacities? What would be the impact on our inventories? Yeah, and maybe 20 years ago, inventory was always the buffer. Yeah, and we could balance the demand. So we were selling less, but we just kept producing. The inventory went up. Yeah, and then maybe we sold a bit more, but there was a big inventory in between. So as long as inventory is not a big problem, it's still okay. But what I see is that because inventory represents a lot of cash and finance wants to reduce the inventory to generate cash, well, when that inventory becomes under pressure, or when we don't necessarily have enough capacity, which was also the case in the COVID period, that's when you really close the triangle. When the inventory or the fixed assets, the capacity start playing a role and become a constraint, that's when you close the triangle. When you close the triangle, that's when you create a pressure. And that's when you need good collaborative processes to really bridge the service side, the cost side, the production side, and the inventory side. And that's where a process like S&OP or IBP really has to play a key role.
And since it's really important for companies to try to implement a collaboration process like S&OP, why they fail to implement this process? I have seen many companies that some of them have the tools, but they don't implement it in correct way. And other companies that have tools, have S&OP systems and process and everything, but they think that is not a good process, and they should get rid of S&OP, and they should start working in a different way. And they think that that system like demand driven will replace S&OP, and they have that kind of ideas. Why do you think most of companies have that idea about S&OP?
Yeah, I think a big challenge in many companies is that S&OP is still seen as a supply chain process. And I also often say to supply chain people, if you want to improve S&OP, don't talk about S&OP. Because the moment you start talking about S&OP, they will say, hey, that's your process, that's your problem. It's not my problem. And that's not true. So I often say, if you want to improve S&OP, don't start with S&OP, but for instance, start with that supply chain triangle. That's what I always do. I do a workshop with a cross-functional team, sales, finance, CEO, marketing, operations, purchasing, full cross-functional team. I explain the supply chain triangle. I draw it on a board. I hand out Post-its and I say, okay, tell me what have been your issues over the last 2 years. And then people start writing down on Post-its, and that triangle is full of issues. It's incredible what a mess our supply chains have been. That's what you visualize in the triangle. I said, and the next question I ask to companies is this a problem? And people look at me, why is he asking that question? I said, yeah, I know you a little bit. Maybe you tell me, hey, Bram, we want to grow, and we grow by pushing the gas. And if we push the gas, there is some collateral damage. So I try to provoke them a little bit. And most often the consensus is, no, this is not okay. This is really a problem. We had service issues during COVID, and now we have too much inventory. And we had increases in cost prices, or we're not finding the right people. And all of that pressure in that triangle is really a problem. Well, when everybody agrees it is a problem, then you can start talking about the solution. And S&OP can be part of the solution. Another solution could be, maybe we need to look if we can afford a little bit more inventory or a bit more working capital, right? So financial questions could also be part of the solution. Or maybe we should see if we can make our assets a bit more flexible. Like, now we have 5 production plants, but each production plant can make only 1 product. Maybe we need to try to increase our flexibility, which is not S&OP. That's an investment question. It's a CapEx question. Yeah. So I often say, try to start from the problem. Don't start from the solution. And once everybody agrees on the problem, then it becomes much harder for sales to say, oh, but I'm not interested in the forecasting. Hey, but we agreed that that's a problem. If that's the problem we are going to fix, you have to collaborate in the forecasting process, right? Or if finance says, yeah, but we're not really interested in the supply chain planning, so we don't want to move into IBP and integrate the financial planning and the supply chain planning. Here again, if we all agree that there is a problem over there in that supply chain triangle, yeah, then finance has to make sure that it provides the right financial data to the S&OP process so that supply chain can make decisions based on the right financial information. In the current uncertain market circumstances, it's unfair and unprofessional not to provide supply chain with that financial information. But yeah, I think it's always, I think S&OP has, it's like, how do you say that? Put the cart before the horse, or how do you say that in English?
Yeah.
So supply chain people sometimes get too carried away, but we want to do S&OP. And I had somebody and they said, hey, Bram, I want to improve S&OP. And I said, how is your service? Our service is good. How is your cost? But we have very high margin products. Cost is not a problem. And I said, what about inventory? But we are a family-owned company. Inventory is not a problem. And then I said, hey, but if you don't have a problem, then maybe you don't need S&OP, right? So really, first define what you want to solve, and only then begin about S&OP. I think that's part of what is going wrong, why people tend to see it as a supply chain process rather than see it as a business process. And S&OP is not a goal in itself. S&OP is only a means to an end. So as long as we can't clarify to the organization why we want to do S&OP, nobody will be interested. And you know what? They are right. I wouldn't be interested either.
Okay, great. And you have talked about finance, and always in companies, you have the finance team that most of the times they have the final word in everything, because companies and organizations are about profit. But they have like different planning systems. They look everything in a different way. And most of the time they take decisions like we should reduce inventory to have more cash flows, but they don't see all the impact in the supply chains. Myself, I came from the financial department. I arrived to the supply chain, and I have seen always this problem. You have financial goals that are not in relationship with the supply chain, and you have supply chain decision and ideas that don't have any relationship with the financial part of the company. So how can we improve this relationship between these two parts of the company, so supply chain and finance can have similar goals or work together towards the same goal?
Yeah. Let me start by saying that I think it's a common situation that supply chain and finance have their own planning processes based on different assumptions. And then we try to align the two plans. That's called IBP, trying to integrate the two. But if you really start from different assumptions, sometimes we have even different routings with different run rates, one for the financial process and the budgeting, and that is different from the real run rates. I don't understand that. Doing that again today in the current volatile market circumstances is irresponsible. It's irresponsible behavior. Any shareholder who sees that in their company should fire the CEO, the CFO, and the supply chain VP. Because today, we need to be close to the ball, and having disconnected planning processes is irresponsible behavior. It's throwing money out of the window. And I can't understand nor accept that any company would do that, or any investor would be happy with that, right? Also, what we are doing, I think it has to do with a lack of trust. I think finance doesn't want to rely on the process of supply chain because they don't trust the supply chain people. The supply chain people are the technical nerds who always complain and always come with a lot of technical stuff. You also feel that finance in general feels that they are superior to the supply chain people. And so they are not going to come down to the supply chain world. They want to stay a bit in their finance ivory tower. But again, it's completely crazy. What are we doing today? We have a good planning process in supply chain. Typically, we have invested a lot of money in processes, in tools, in good people. We are duplicating that process in the finance department. Here it's called the FP&A process. Here it's the S&OP process. And then we are tripling the effort by trying to integrate the three. Also, no finance person can be in favor of something that is tripling the cost. And maybe 20 years ago, systems were not powerful enough to do everything in one system. Today it is, right? We do planning implementations. If we load a bill of material, yeah, the material consumption is there, yeah, but also the cost of the product is there, like the standard cost price. And so technically, it's not that difficult to make one integrated plan, which has the volumes and also have the values, at least the sales values, and at least like gross margin. Yeah, and it's not that difficult to refine some of the costing in there. So that we're not doing it today, the reason is not technical, the technology is there. It's really in the minds of the CFO and the VP supply chain. There is a lack of trust. They don't understand each other. The average supply chain person doesn't talk the language of finance, and the average finance person doesn't understand or talk the language of supply chain. So I think, yeah, what I'm trying to do now is bring that message and, for instance, use that supply chain triangle to say, you know what, in the end, supply chain and finance have the same objective. It's about driving value. And how can we improve the service, because service is driving the top line or the sales. But it's not just about the top line. I also need to look at the cost. Well, the top line minus the cost gives the margin. And in the end, it's okay, what's the margin I'm able to generate based on the CapEx I've done, the fixed assets, and based on the inventory I have, the working capital. So how can I optimize the margin I generate from my inventories and from my fixed assets, which is a financial objective. So that supply chain triangle clearly shows that finance and supply chain have the same objective. Yeah. So then we also need to find ways to really align the processes and not just connect them, not start from a different base and then try to align. That's IBP. I don't believe in that. My proposal is really to have one integrated process where we start from the same assumptions. And I can imagine finance will say, hey, but we are a publicly listed company. I understand if you communicate something towards shareholders that you want to be cautious. Well, in the S&OP meeting, we should say, okay, what's the best guess? The best guess is we will sell 100. What are we willing to communicate towards the outside world? Well, let's not yet communicate the 100. Let's communicate 95, right? It's better to be a bit more conservative when we communicate to the outside world and then outperform. But that should be part of a normal S&OP debate. We don't need two separate planning processes to manage that. So I see it as a big issue that it is disconnected. I see it as highly unprofessional that companies work in this way. And I think we need to help supply chain people to better understand the language of finance. We need to help finance people to better understand the language from supply chains. And we need to find ways to bring the two functions much closer to each other and align on one common planning process. It's a long answer, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I understand. And always people think when they try to align this process, they think about technology, and they always believe that technology will answer everything. Like right now that we have artificial intelligence and generative AI and things like that, they say it doesn't matter. We're going to change our ERP system in a couple of months or a couple of years, and then we will solve everything. Then they change the system, and then you have the same problems, and sometimes you have bigger problems. What can we recommend companies, organizations about technology and how to integrate things through technology, but don't see technology as the solution? Instead, see technology as a part of a bigger system. How companies should see technology in this integration of the planning inside companies?
Yeah. I agree that companies overly focus on the technology component, and the technology components also get hyped. So when AI became more popular, it immediately gets hyped. Now it's ChatGPT. So now we think that ChatGPT will take over the role of the planner in the organization. So every time there's a new technology, we have unrealistic expectation, because that's basically that's at some point it is really unrealistic. And we think that technology will solve it, but it's always 4 components. We say it's about the people, it's about the processes, it's about the tools, and it's about the analytics. Supply chain is about a lot of data. Yeah? So I really believe that analytics like AI or ChatGPT, but also in the past, mathematical or statistical forecasting techniques or optimization techniques, the analytical techniques can really help to better process the massive amount of data we have in the tools. But what is often overlooked is more that people component and that process component. And we will need to have the courage to say, instead of having 2 separate planning processes in the finance department and the supply chain department, we will need to redefine one common process. And how we start from the same base, and maybe how at the end we make 2 branches, what will go into the operational plan and what are we going to communicate towards investors, right? So the branch should be at the end, not in the beginning. So people don't think through the processes, and I think it also has to do a lot with a lack of knowledge and a lot of understanding. If I look at the average executive team, I often say RVP of sales, that's really an expert in sales. He started his career, or she started her career in sales, and then she grew into a regional sales manager, but she spent all her life in sales. And then we say our RVP of manufacturing, that's really an expert in manufacturing. Yeah? So typically an executive team is a team of functional experts. You could even say functional idiots. They are expert in their domain, but they have no clue of each other's world. Yeah. And I think, that's one of the big hurdles, to better implement supply chain processes, because supply chain is really about connecting all those different functions, collecting the demand information from the sales organization, and then connecting that to the production plans in the supply organization, and towards requirements of key suppliers. And I think there's a lot of education that needs to be done all the way up to the executive team to help people to better understand, if I do something on the sales side, for instance, introduce more products, what is the impact on the supply chain, or what is the impact on manufacturing? It could create fragmentation, more changeovers that could negatively impact my cost. And also more SKUs, fragmentation. If everything needs to be delivered with short lead times, I might need more inventory. So it will also negatively impact my inventory turns. And I see that sales is very good in sales, but doesn't necessarily understand what is the impact across the supply chain. And quite often, supply chain people have a very narrow focus on cost and cost reduction, but they don't necessarily understand, if we reduce the product portfolio and cut SKUs, what could be the impact on the position of the company in the market. And helping executive teams to better understand how the different pieces of the puzzle fit together. For me, that is the single biggest hurdle to drive more adoption of more integrated planning processes as an example, and to make S&OP more successful. It's not in the technology, it's really in the minds of the people. It's not the artificial intelligence, it's the human intelligence that is lacking today.
And when you talk about supply chain, that most people in supply chain are too narrow in the idea of cost, and they always look back to the supply chain department or the operational department, and finance always ask cost reduction. And I have always said, if you want to completely reduce costs, it's better to close the company, so you will have zero cost once you terminate everything. But that is a huge problem, because you cannot keep reducing costs and not affecting service level, and not affecting the future of a company. You cannot reduce inventory forever, because one, you want to try to serve your customer, you will not have enough inventory, you will not have goods and things to react fast enough. So why most companies see supply chain as a place to only reduce costs instead of creating value? Why they think that is a place to go and reduce costs, and not a place to create value for the company?
Yeah, I think that is because finance has a too simplistic view of the world. And from their too simplistic view of the world, they can cause a lot of harm and they can cause a lot of damage. I often say that most supply chains indeed are designed for minimum cost. But designing a supply chain for minimum cost is only right if the strategy in the market is to provide the lowest price. And so if you say, I'm in a commodity market and the reason why customers buy from me is because I have the lowest price, well, then you should design your supply chain for lowest cost. Yeah. And that's how we link supply chain to strategy. If you say, hey, but I want to be driven by total solution. Yeah? We've worked for a manufacturer of PVC window profiles, and they say, we're not just a producer of window profiles, we deliver window systems. So our customers are the ones who are making the windows. We have a lot of product knowledge. So we say, okay, we want to have windows which are very good against hurricanes, which are much more energy conserving. And then it's okay, we think with our customers, what type of profiles do we need? And we also make sure that we can deliver everything they need to then make the window. And so the profiles, but maybe also some accessories. If you want to differentiate by creating that total solution, yeah, automatically you will have a much broader product portfolio. If you have a much broader product portfolio, that will create a lot more inventory. If you push that type of supply chain to a cost which is too low, you are basically undermining your competitive advantage. And I would say finance doesn't really understand the impact of the strategy on the supply chain. And they only know one recipe. It's the recipe of minimum cost. Again, maybe that was good enough 30 years ago, but that's no longer good enough in the current complex markets we are operating in. So there's two options. Either we upgrade the supply chain knowledge in the finance community, or either we give more power to the supply chain community to say to finance, no, we are not going to reduce the cost. The problem is not in the cost. The problem is in the fact that, yeah, we have a complex product portfolio, and basically the problem is that those customers are not willing to pay the right premium to deliver that total solution. Sometimes we not even have a supply chain problem, but we have a strategic problem. Yeah? And we say, yeah, some customers are just cherry picking, yeah? And they only buy this and that and that. Yeah? And the more complex stuff, I don't know, they buy from somebody else. So tying that supply chain back into strategic questions and into pricing questions. And so that's typically not the position that supply chain has today, but I think that's also the position that supply chain needs to try and conquer.
Yeah, most of the time when people go and see supply chain, they just see the operation part of the supply chain. Sometimes they see the tactical parts of the supply chain. Most of the time, they lack the idea that supply chain is part of something bigger that is the strategic part of the company. And since most people think that way about supply chain, and if you see people before COVID don't even know that there was a supply chain in companies. I have seen say always that many people didn't knew what was my job before COVID. Since COVID, they at least I have a better understanding of what I'm doing in daily basis. But having that in mind, inside companies, how the supply chain departments can get a better position in companies, because most of the times when you see companies, you have the financial department and the marketing department or sales department that are the ones in charge of things in companies, the strategic ideas, and then they hope that supply chain will deliver that. And if the supply chain cannot deliver that, then they will say, we don't have a good supply chain. But most of the time, it's not that we don't have a good supply chain. That is something that is not possible to do it, or if we want to do it, because or the system will be too complex to deliver that. So how a supply chain department can get a better position inside organizations, and how the supply chain people can get a better positions inside societies, selling the idea that we need supply chain to deliver goods and service, and that is important to take care and good understanding of supply chain to have better results as a society.
Yeah, I would say start by reading my books. My latest book is over here. I will quickly show them. But it's so the first book is called Supply Chain Strategy and Financial Metrics. So make sure that you know how to connect supply chain to financial metrics and to strategy. And the second book here is called The Strategy Driven Supply Chain, and that also tries to explain how to better link the supply chain to the strategy. And I've written those books to structure my own minds, but potentially also to help supply chain people to engage in a different debate. I'll try to give maybe one or two examples. I think last year I had a COO and a plant manager who were visiting me, and they were frustrated. They said, Bram, we had to double the production volume in 3 months' time. Of course, we had to do that with a lot of interim labor. And okay, interim labor is not as efficient as well-trained people. So our efficiency went down. So the cost was not good. So the business was not happy. That's one. And two, finance wants us to reduce the inventory. So we had to double the production volume in 3 months' time. And at the same time, yeah, we had to keep the inventory stable or reduce the inventory. And I said, yeah, I said, it's crazy. Yeah? I said, it's like pushing the gas and at the same time pushing the brake. I say, if you do that, yeah, it's not very good for the engine and it gets very smelly. I said, that's what I smell right now. I said two things. I said, one, you should not accept that finance tells you up to an individual product line what should be the inventory target. Yeah? I can accept that finance says overall the inventory should go down with 5%. For financial reasons, we need to generate cash flow because we have to reduce our debt position. That's okay, that's fine. Yeah. But then you as a supply chain or operations professional, in the beginning of the year or when you make the budget, you should sit down with the business and say, look, dear business manager, we have 10 product lines. You tell me out of those 10 product lines, which are the ones we are going to run on efficiency, maybe these 5, and which are the ones where you say, okay, this is where I see the biggest growth potential. So if this one starts growing, this is where I really want us to be able to scale and to follow. Plus, yeah, this was a product leader. Yeah? So they bring innovations to the market. They say, you are a product leader. What is your job? You bring new products to the market, you should know upfront, if you launch 10 new products, that out of the 10, maybe 5 will be unsuccessful, 2 or 3 will be so-so, and 2 could be a huge success. And so here again, try to make upfront scenarios together with the business and say, okay, what type of scalability do you want? Do we need to be able to grow with 20% in 1 year time, or do we need to be able to double the volume in 3 months time? Yeah. Because if you need to be able to double the volume in 3 months time, you need to make sure that your suppliers are able to follow, that you are able to scale. So don't be caught by surprise. So if as supply chain or operations people, we are more proactive in asking questions to the business and asking the business to make decisions, we cannot decide as supply chain. It's a business decision in the end. But I think we can become much better in asking the right questions. And if we ask the right questions upfront, we are in a much more tactical strategic position, where today we don't ask the question. Yeah. All of a sudden we see that the volume doubles, and then we like to firefight in supply chain. We are excellent firefighters. We like to firefight, and we like to complain that the business has not told us that this product would go because the forecast was so bad. So I think by being much more proactive, and I hope that these books trigger some thoughts on how to engage in a different debate. But that's one example, I think, on how we as supply chain, by asking different questions earlier on in the process, we can create a completely different world and position for ourselves.
Great. I think that is really, really important for people in supply chain to have all these ideas in mind and start asking the right questions to business departments, to sales department. So in that way, the supply chain can be part of this strategic planning of companies. And one important thing is how you see the future of the supply chain. The near future, since we have a lot of changes due to health issues, to the war between Russia and Ukraine, things between US and China, and different problems around the world. Plus, we have an aging population around the world in different countries. You have immigration in many parts of the world. We have a lot of those problems. We have climate issues, and we have technology and everything related with AI and things like that. So right now we are in a situation where everything is changing. So how you see the future of the supply chain and the person that is in supply chain in the future, how the supply chain will be in the future, having all these ideas in mind that everything is changing right now?
Yeah. Difficult question. I don't have a crystal ball, but I'll give you my gut feeling, or maybe I will give you my dream. That's even better. Yeah. My feeling is that the world of supply chain will be split in 2 parts. I think that part of the supply chain world will remain in that operational logistics type of jobs and environment. Also, when I do workshops or when I challenge people based on these books, I feel that half of the supply chain world says, Bram, I don't really know if I want to be involved in those strategic discussions. Yeah, but I think that's fine. Only I would then say, well, instead of calling that supply chain, call it logistics, or logistics and customer service. So today we would say the VP of supply chain, what's the responsibility? Logistics and customer service. No, but then call it the VP of logistics and customer service. That's not supply chain. Yeah. And I think half of the supply chain world will say, hey, if I look at that supply chain triangle, and typically the salespeople are more focused on that service corner. Like we want to improve service, we want to score service, we want to grow the service. Yeah. Operations is typically more pulling the cost side, and it's typically finance who is concerned with that inventory or the cash. And for me, the natural position of supply chain is at the heart of that triangle and balance that triangle. But you don't balance the triangle from logistics. You balance the triangle from S&OP processes. I also believe that supply chains should be the moderator of the strategic planning process. Not that supply chain needs to define the strategy, but supply chain needs to be there as the challenger. Also in S&OP, supply chain is not defining the forecast, sales is defining the forecast. Well, the same in the strategic planning process. Supply chain should not define the strategic value proposition, but supply chain should challenge and say, hey, sales, do you really believe that we will be able to drive that type of volumes at those price levels with that type of positioning in the market? Are we really sure? And also on a strategic level, supply chain should challenge operations and say, hey, operations, are we really sure this is the way we want to set up the plant? That seems to be very good for efficiency. But if I look at what we might need from a market perspective, it's much more about small volumes and flexibility, right? So make sure that what we do here and there is aligned. So I think half of supply chain might remain in the logistics of customer service, but I hope that half of supply chain will really be center stage in that triangle, become responsible not just for the S&OP, but for more planning processes, also be the moderator of the strategic planning processes. And if it's up to me, also for the budgeting process, because also in the budget, we need to decide, okay, what will we allow as an inventory budget? Don't ask finance to define the inventory budget. Why? Finance doesn't understand inventory. So if finance defines the inventory budget, per definition, it's wrong. Finance thinks inventory is elastic. If you push on it, it goes down. Yeah, but if you push on it too far, you affect the service and the costs. That's what finance doesn't understand. So also there, I think supply chain should be defining the inventory budgets or the working capital budget. And if I tell that to supply chain people, they are afraid. I think they say, hey, but am I really up to this task? Do I have sufficient financial knowledge? Probably I don't. Do I have sufficient strategic experience? No, I don't. But I think supply chain is very well positioned because a supply chain really understands the connections between the sales and the operations and the impact on inventories. It understands the connections of all those key parameters. So I hope that at least half of that supply chain community will shift towards that more strategic, tactical strategic role, which again, I also have described in my books here.
Great. So I understand that at the end we will have maybe a split, or well, anyway, they will keep working together between one that is the execution part, that will be the logistic and production part, and the other that will be more tactical and strategic, that will be the planning, the planning part. And finally, having in mind that there are different views about the supply chain and the logistic, and that is a field that not too many people have a clear understanding on how it works, how we can help people that are outside the supply chain to get a better understanding of what we're doing inside the supply chain. Because most of them, maybe I think that it would be a great idea for people to try to read your books, that people that work in the supply chain. But most of the people that are outside of the supply chain, they will say, no, I have a small abstract about how to understand a supply chain. They want something a lot faster to understand, and other way to understand. How we can do that to make them understand a lot faster how supply chain works? How we can help them to understand us?
Yeah. I think my best answer so far is that supply chain triangle. It's simple enough that everybody understands, and it's complex enough in the sense that it shows some of the key trade-offs and the key struggles within companies. It allows to link supply chain to financial impact. It allows to show the impact of strategy on key supply chain parameters. So I think What we should not do is use technical language. Again, don't talk about SNOP, don't talk about SNOE, sales and operations execution, don't talk about demand sensing. No, I think we should try to talk business language. Yeah? If we want to convince the non-supply chain expert, we need to talk business language. And again, my experience, if I explain that triangle and I hand out post-its, everybody's in. Sales will start showing their problems, finance will start showing their problems. So that triangle is something that connects. If you start with SNOP, people already fall asleep. They're not interested, right? So we need to bring the right concepts to the table. And also, salespeople love strategy. So talk about strategy. Again, that's also why I say strategy driven. The supply chain is next. It starts with the strategy. So, okay, what is the market looking like? How do we want to stand out? What is our competitive position? And when you do exercises, and the book describes how you can do those exercises. Also, if you read the book, even there is a book website where there is like surveys you can fill in for free. So which help you to reveal your strategic profile and get that discussion started within your executive team, but they like it. And I gave the example of that producer of window profiles. Like once everybody agrees, like this is how we want to position, we want to be able to deliver a total solution for our customer. Once everybody agrees on that, then you can connect it to supply chain. And so that's, for instance, when I say, hey, but if that's what you want to deliver, you will always have a complex portfolio. If you always have a complex portfolio, we really need to think through if all of this should be made to stock, because if all of this complex portfolio needs to be made to stock, it's going to be prohibitively expensive. And that's how you can gradually explain the trade-offs. And then they say, well, maybe we should indeed say that parts of the portfolio are made to stock and parts of the portfolio are made to order. Like if it's really customer specific product, it could be made to order. If it's a catalog product, it can be made to stock. But I see that quite often salespeople make to stock, make to order decisions, but they cannot judge. They don't understand the impact on the supply chain. So we should avoid that salespeople are making those decisions. But again, if you start from the strategy, or if you start from the triangle, it's much easier to connect to them. Yeah, and then it will also be much easier for them to understand what is the impact on the supply chain. And if they better understand what is the impact on the supply chain, they do care. Yeah, and then it's much easier for them to engage in, okay, what do we then think is the best option or solution for us as a company? Then you can really come into that joint decision making. That's the best answer I have found so far.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot. I think that that's really clear, and that will be really helpful. Once again, Bram, thanks a lot for your time and your effort to be here with us.
My pleasure.